Okay, welcome everyone to Daf Yomi, 1 week at a time. Our first lesson of Masechet Yoma. This is very exciting to see everyone as we continue on to the next Masechet. And today we are going to learn Daf Bet 2 through 9. We did not do the beginning of Masechet Yoma last week. And as always, we start on Daf 2 as opposed to Daf 1 because we are continuing in our learning. Our learning doesn't begin or end, it just continues. So as I mentioned last week, Masechet Yoma is going to be dealing with the events that lead up to Yom Kippur and Yom Kippur itself, and specifically in the Beit HaMikdash. And what I think is very interesting about Masechet Yoma is that before you learn this Masechet, when you think of Yom Kippur, I would say, if I asked you, what do you think of when you think of Yom Kippur, you would say fasting, being in shul all day, long davening. That's very different than what it was like in the Beit HaMikdash in the time of the temple. And that is what we are going to learn together for the next few months. What happened in the time when there was a temple? What were the jobs that were done? Who did them? How were they done? And basically what it looked like, again, in a temple-centric religion. And as I've mentioned before, my friend Shuli Mishkan wrote a really beautiful piece today, actually, on Hadran about Judaism in the time of the first temple and versus Judaism in the time of the second temple. And I would take it one step further to what is Judaism today, right? Meaning we're so used to our religion being centered around either our shul or our personal prayers, where when there was a temple, things were much more centralized in Jerusalem. So it's just an interesting thing to think about, and would definitely for today's daf, meaning at the end of this shiur, today's daf talked about the differences in the times of the first and the second temple. What were things like? So we'll get there in a little bit, but let's start with our first daf bet, page number 2. Where the Mishnah tells us that 7 days before Yom Kippur, the Kohen Gadol would be sequestered on the Temple Mount. So we see here again, Daf HaChaim, a really great picture. You can see the temple, I guess, what it might have looked like in the time of the second temple. Anytime you see a really big building, that's the second temple. That was what Herod built. And you see the Kohen Gadol leaving his house. And it says that he moves in to the Lishkat Parhedrin. This was an area on the Temple Mount. We'll discuss where and its name in a little bit. They said that they also prepared a substitute Kohen Gadol, an understudy, lest something happens and the Kohen Gadol cannot do his work. There will be another Kohen who is going to learn the job as well. The Mishnah suggests maybe there should be another wife kind of waiting in the wings just in case the Kohen's wife dies. As the Gemara will say that the Kohen needs to be married in order to be the representative of the people. And if he does not have a wife, he cannot perform his duties. Maybe there should be a substitute wife or an understudy. The Gemara says, don't push it. That's going a little too far. We do not get an understudy wife, but we do have an understudy Kohen Gadol. The Gemara then it tells us that not only does the Kohen on Yom Kippur, the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, move into the Beit HaMikdash, to the temple, but so too the Kohen. Now, this is not the high priest, this is any one of the priests who is going to do the special service with the Para Aduma, the red heifer. So 7 days before he's going to slaughter the red heifer, he is going to also be sequestered on the Temple Mount. So here is just a great picture. Remember our ramp that was set up between the Temple Mount and the Mount of Olives, Har HaZeitim, across. That is where the Para Aduma, the ceremony, took place. So we see here again, this Kohen, this priest, and our high priest are both going to be sequestered for 7 days on the Temple Mount. Now, the question is, where is this? Where is the lishka? Where is the place that these two kohanim are going to go? It is on the northeast corner of the courtyard, and it says that it needs to be, again, there's this idea that there is atonement, and therefore that happens in the north, and it needs to be opposite the entrance, and therefore it is in the east, and therefore it is in the northeast corner. From here, the Gemara is going to now spend about a whole daf explaining where we get this idea that the priest needs to leave his home and be on the Temple Mount for 7 days. And interestingly enough, we did read about this 2 weeks ago in Parshat Shmini, but we learned about the 7 days of the Miluim. When they first built the Tabernacle, the Mishkan, in the desert, they sequestered the priests for 7 days in order to train them on what their jobs would be. And because we have this idea that there was a sequestering for 7 days, the Gemara learns 7 days there, 7 days here. So we know that for sure there were 7 days in Miluim, in the desert. And now the question is, when else is this going to happen? Now, we know the punchline already. We know that it's for Para Aduma, for the red heifer, and for Yom Kippur. But the Gemara is going to try and figure it out thematically, why these two instances and no other, right? Maybe we should sequester the priest for other holidays as well. Why specifically on these two, I was going to say holidays, but this one holiday and this one event? Why specifically these things? So the Gemara says, well, it says the word tsiva, and that it should be done before the action happens. And again, the Gemara is going to use exposition, meaning a gzeira shava, right? Let's see, a verse has one word. Let's look for another verse with the same word. Maybe we can compare it. So we see a comparison linguistically between the Miluim in the desert and Para Aduma, again, the ceremony with the red heifer, the same thing, we have the word la'asot, to do, so that is going to compare it to the Para Aduma, and it's going to be compared to Yom Kippur because it says lechaper. It is there to atone. What other day do we have atonement? Yom Kippur. So therefore, the Kohen Gadol needs to be separated. Also, the Gemara mentions at the bottom of Daf 2 that it's 1 day a year, not the other holidays. The other holidays are 7 days a year, right? For 7 days, meaning Sukkot, Pesach. The Gemara says we're not going to sequester someone, right? The priests for a 7-day holiday, but we will for 1 day. Also, let's look at the similarities of the sacrifices that were given on those days. On Daf 3, they're going to try and see, maybe it will be another holiday, maybe Shavuot, right? Again, Shavuot is one day. Maybe we should separate or sequester the Kohen Gadol, the Kohen, or any priest that's going to work on Shavuot. So we say no. The priests that are going to do the work on Shavuot, the sacrifices that are given on Shavuot are different than the sacrifices that were given when the Jews were in the desert during the Miluim. Then the Gemara asks, maybe we should look at Rosh Hashanah. And again, they're going to look at the sacrifices. So we see, oh, look, there are similar sacrifices, and seems to be one day. Interestingly enough, I know that we celebrate Rosh Hashanah for 2 days, but really it is a one-day holiday. We're just not sure exactly what day it is. But we say no, the difference is, you're right that they have the same korbanot, the same sacrifices, but on Rosh Hashanah, those sacrifices are communal, right? It says from the tzibur, so they are communal, whereas in Miluim, when they were in the desert, and on Yom Kippur, those sacrifices actually came from the priest's own money. And the Gemara on Daf 3 discusses how we know that in these two instances, the priest needed to bring these animals from their own money, right? So it says that Aaron should make it for himself, right? It says asher lo, for him, and the Gemara says that it needs to be his, right, his money. It says kach lecha, take for you, meaning you need to supply the animals for the sacrifices, and therefore both in Yom Kippur and in the 7 days of training in the desert, they needed to bring animals from their own money, and therefore we're going to compare those two holidays or instances as opposed to Rosh Hashanah, which were the animals were bought from communal funds. So again, we see here there's a cow or a bull, a par, which is going to be the chatat, the sin offering, and there is an ayal, right, a ram, that is going to be the olah, right, that will be completely sacrificed on the altar. And both of these are done by the high priest, as opposed to other holidays where it does not need to be done by the high priest. So we see, again, we're going to learn from the sequestering of the priests on the 7 days of the Miluim to Yom Kippur, that the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, needs to be sequestered or separated for 7 days. The question is why? Why does he need to be separated? And the Gemara says, right, whenever we have a first, what is the first? This is the first time that the Kohen Gadol is going to enter the Kodesh HaKodashim, the holiest place in the temple. And in the Miluim, it was also the first time that the priests were going to do their work. And therefore, in both instances, they are separated for 7 days. Okay. What about the understudy? Remember, we said that there is an understudy for the priest. The understudy does not have to be separated. Only the high priest needs to be separated. From here, we're going to go to another, I think, very interesting discussion. We said we're going to learn it from the verse, or from the idea that the priests were separated for the training of the tabernacle, the Mishkan. But interestingly enough, on Daf 3, we have another comparison, and that is to the receiving of the Torah. And I think that it's so beautiful that we are in the middle of Sfirat HaOmer, as Lynn posted in the chat group. We are counting the Omer till we get to Shavuot. And as we know, right, on Shavuot, we're going to celebrate the receiving of the Torah. And on Daf 3 and 4, we're going to discuss the events that that led up to the receiving of the Torah. So Reish Lakish says that Hashem called out to Moshe on the seventh day at Har Sinai, and there was a cloud that covered him for 6 days. And the Gemara says here that we learn from this that anyone who comes in contact with God needs to be separated from everyone else for 6 days. Now you're going to say, wait a minute, we just said 7 days, so why 6 days? So how do we get 7 days? So the Gemara says we're going to add a day lest he become tameh from his wife, lest the Kohen Gadol become impure from his wife, right? If he has relations with his wife and she is impure, then he will become impure, and then he will not be able to do his work in the temple. We're going to talk about this in a little bit, but really the Gemara says that 6 days is enough, but we've added one more to make it 7. But the Gemara is saying that we're learning it from Moshe, who seems to be separated from everyone else before he received the Torah. So at the top of Daf 4, the Gemara discusses, but wait a minute, you just compared the Miluim, again, in the desert, to Yom Kippur, and to the Para Aduma, the ceremony that they did with the red heifer. Remember, we compared all 3. But the Gemara says on the top of 4, how are you comparing these 3? There are differences, right? In the time of the Miluim, which we read about a few weeks ago in Parshat Shavua, they were actually sprinkled with blood every day. But in these other 2 instances, again, Para Aduma and Yom Kippur, they were sprinkled with water and the ashes of the red heifer. So how is that similar? So the Gemara says, no, it's okay. Water and blood, they're both being sprinkled, and we can compare them. And the Gemara says, wait, but there was no sprinkling on Har Sinai. So we say, no, really, that's just a stringency, the sprinkling. You don't really need it. And it's really about the sequestering, the separating the person who is going to encounter God from everybody else. And from here, the Gemara continues and talks about what happened when when Moshe received the Torah. And it said that hold on one second. Okay, so it says that Moshe, right, again, that we said the cloud covered Moshe, and he was sanctified by this cloud. The question is, when did the cloud come? Was it after they received the 10 Commandments, right? So then it was, they received the 10 Commandments, then Moshe went up to Har Sinai. He was like encased or enclosed in this cloud for 6 days, and then on the 7th day, he now came into contact with God. So then those 6 days would have to be part of the 40 days that Moshe was up on Har Sinai. Or we say, no, the cloud came earlier, from Rosh Chodesh Sivan, for 6 days before they received the 10 Commandments, right? So you can see here on top, it's either 6 days before or maybe the first 6 days after they received the Torah, or maybe the cloud covered Har Sinai and not Moshe. Meaning, again, till now we've been talking about the cloud covering Moshe specifically, but maybe the cloud covered the mountain and it wasn't about Moshe at all. Or maybe the cloud was on Moshe, but it was about cleansing Moshe like from all the food that he had eaten so that he could be more angel-like. And it wasn't really about sequestering him from everyone else. Or maybe that cloud was there to instill fear in in Moshe. This idea, and here the Gemara mentions on Daf 4 the idea of gilu b'ra'ada, right? That when we're rejoicing, there should be some trepidation, right? Meaning there should be this element of awe, and therefore God enclosed or covered the mountain with a cloud to kind of instill some fear in Moshe. So it's interesting to think about what this means in terms of our encounter with God. And the Gemara says, what really are they arguing about? And the Gemara says that maybe they were arguing about what was the date that we received the Torah. Again, this is very fitting for Shavuot, right? We know that we celebrate Shavuot on the 6th of Sivan. The question is, but interestingly enough, right, there's a machloket, there's a disagreement as to the date that the Torah was given. Was it given on the 6th of Sivan, and then Moshe went up on the 7th? Or was the Torah given on the 7th, and then Moshe went up on the same day? So it's interesting to understand that even though we celebrate Matan Torah, the giving of the Torah, on the 6th, there is a difference of opinion. It could have been the 6th, and it could have been the 7th. Everyone agrees that Moshe went up on the 7th. The question is, did they receive the 10 Commandments the day before or on the same day? And again, when did the cloud come? Either on Rosh Chodesh, meaning on the 1st of Sivan for the mountain, or on the 7th day for Moshe. So again, a difference of opinion. And here, very famously, there's a discussion about the Torah being given on the 7th. Why? Because if the Torah was given on the 7th, then the first tablets were broken on the 17th day of Tammuz, on Yud Zayin b'Tammuz. Famously, it's mentioned in Masechet Ta'anit that we fast on Yud Zayin b'Tammuz. One of the reasons is because the tablets were broken on that day, right? That was the day that Moshe came down. And then there's another opinion that Moshe only went up on the 13th of Sivan. So just interesting, we take a lot of these dates for granted and don't realize that there are differences of opinions. And from here, the Gemara continues and says, right, if there's this cloud covering Moshe and the mountain, what happened, right? So the Gemara says that Hashem called out to Moshe and to Bnei Israel, right? They were all standing there. And it seems maybe only Moshe heard it, or, right, like at Har Sinai, everybody heard it, but at the Ohel Moed, only Moshe heard it, or, again, maybe there's a difference in terms of the words, right? When it says Vayikra, to call out, maybe God speaks to everyone, but when it says Lemor, to speak, that's only speaking directly to Moshe. And again, the Gemara continues and says that Moshe couldn't go directly into the Ohel Moed, and now we're talking about the Tabernacle, the Mishkan, because there was a cloud in it. But it also says that Moshe came into the cloud. So how does that work? He couldn't go in, or he could go in? So the Gemara says that Hashem, really Moshe couldn't go in, but Hashem brought him into the cloud, right? He couldn't go in by himself. And again, we have this comparison between into the cloud and into the sea, with the splitting of the sea that, right, the Jewish people went into the sea. So it seems that the Gemara says maybe there was a path, right? Just like there was a path in the Red Sea, so too there was a path in the cloud, and that's how Moshe could go into that cloud. So again, beautiful imagery, and I just thought about this. Like maybe the idea is to connect, right, Pesach and Shavuot, right, comparing the crossing of the sea and the receiving of the Torah. Oh, I never thought of that. Okay, cool. I'm just going to write that down so I remember that. Okay. From here, the Gemara continues and talks about, right, when we say Vayidaber and then Lemor, right, to call out and then to speak. the Gemara says that's actually a lesson for us to learn, that when we want to talk to somebody, we should call out first, right? We say, hello, right? I would just like to, how is your day? But we don't directly start a conversation without some sort of calling out, right? The same thing with God. He calls out to Moshe, and then he starts speaking. So too, the Gemara continues that we can also learn from this that that you can't tell anybody something that you heard. This is very good because of last week's parsha. We talked about lashon hara with the tzarat. With lashon hara, speaking ill of people, right? So the Gemara here tells us that unless, right, you can't tell something that you heard from somebody else unless they said that it's okay for you to repeat it, right? Lemor, you can say it, right? So don't repeat something unless you got permission to repeat it. Okay, the bottom of Daf 4 continues and discusses the service that was done during the Miluim, again in the desert. Now, the Miluim practice, meaning this was training for the priests. It was the first time that we ever had a temple, right? It was the Mishkan, the Tabernacle. And the question is, this was something that was done once in history. How much of it can we learn for things that were done throughout the generations, right? They sequestered the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, every year. So can we compare those two things? So that's what we're going to discuss right now, right? So everyone agrees that the things that were done in the Miluim were necessary, or maybe only things that were done in future work. Those are the things that are necessary, but not things that were done uniquely or specifically for the Miluim. And here at the top of Daf number 5, the Gemara discusses the differences between the work that was done in the desert that one time versus the things that were done every year. So one is the practice that's called smicha. Smicha literally means to lean on, and this was something that was done on the animal before it was sacrificed. And it says that Aaron needed to do smicha, but it wasn't something that was necessary for the generations. So he was supposed to do it, but if he didn't, it's still okay, right? The blood was what really gave them the atonement. You should do the smicha, but if you don't, it's okay. As opposed to in the Miluim, they needed to do it in that practice. Okay, the next thing is the practice that's called tnufa. Tnufa means to lift up, to raise up. So that again was something that was done in the time of the Miluim, but it was not something that was necessary, and if they forgot it, it would be okay. Again, as we mentioned, they had to separate the priest for 7 days. This is not necessary for all other sacrifices, but it was for the time in the Miluim. They did need to separate everyone for 7 days. As we've mentioned before, every year they just separated the high priest, the Kohen Gadol. The idea that the high priest needed to wear all 8 of his clothing, all of his clothes, and be anointed with oil. These are two things that are very important for the high priest. But if it doesn't happen, it is still okay. And the Gemara says it is not necessary. It does not negate all the work that was done. Okay. Though Rabbi Yochanan says, no, all of these things are necessary. It says, kacha, this is how you need to do it. And therefore, all of these things had to be done during the Miluim. Okay. Now, the Gemara now talks about Aharon and how Aaron's sons were killed on the 8th day. That happened in Parshat Shmini, which we read 2 weeks ago. Nadav and Avihu died, and Aaron became what's called an onen. He is a mourner, and he is not allowed to eat from the meat that was sacrificed in the temple, right? But Moshe told him, you need to eat, right? Because that is what God commanded you to do. And he says it a few different times, and the Gemara on Daf 5 explains how Hashem commanded him that he needs to eat from the different sacrifices that were given on that day. And Moshe got upset that Aaron wasn't eating from these sacrifices and that he burnt it instead. He says, because you were commanded, or because God commanded you. And that's just an interesting conversation that happens between Moshe and Aaron. Aaron does end up listening to Moshe for some things, but not for others. From here, the Gemara discusses that the pants were not mentioned in the time of the Miluim, that they had to wear pants. But the Gemara says, don't worry, the Kohanim wore these long tunics, but they needed to wear pants underneath them for modesty issues. So the Gemara says, no, anytime that the work is done in the temple, the priests need to wear their pants when they're doing that work. Okay, then the Gemara discusses, since we're talking about the Miluim, one part of the ceremony was that Moshe needed to dress Aharon, right, his brother, and Aharon's sons, the other priests. And the question is, how did he do this? Right, he had to tie all their belts. Were they tied simultaneously? And if so, how did he do it? Or were they, he dressed them one after the other? The top of Daf 6 says that no, there were really there were different belts, and it was implied that there were two different types of belts. The high priest wore a blue. The belt was blue, meaning tchelet, blue wool, and linen, which is in general what we call shatnez, which is not allowed to mix those two things. Right? We are not allowed to mix wool and linen. Those are things we're not allowed to mix in our garments. But the high priest was allowed to wear a special garment that did mix wool and linen. But the regular Kohen, the regular priest, did wear just a regular linen belt. Or maybe they both had the same belt. That is actually a disagreement at the top of Daf 6. Okay, let's go back to our Kohen Gadol, our high priest, who is being separated for 7 days. Why is he being separated? So we mentioned that we are concerned that the high priest will become impure, because maybe he will have relations with his wife. His wife might be a nida, right? Nida means a woman who is menstruating, and he will become tameh. So now, or impure. And if he is impure, he cannot do his work on Yom Kippur. So let's see how it works. There's a little math involved, but let's go through it a little bit. So it says that first of all, it's obvious that he's not going to do this on purpose. It's going to be accidental. And if it's accidental, it might be retroactive, meaning before he comes to the temple, maybe he will be with his wife, and then the next day she'll find out that she was menstruating, and she's not going to be sure when it started. So maybe it will go 24 hours back, and then he will then be impure. So the question is, and here Daf 6 gets a little complicated and asks, a person, again, a woman who is a nida is impure for 7 days. Now, a man who has relations with a woman who is a nida, he also becomes impure. And the question is he, so we know that he's impure for 7 days, but is he impure like her? in the fact that a woman who is in nida can only go to the mikvah after she completes a full 7 days, meaning on the night of 8, right, of day 8. Or, right, so is the man like her, meaning he can only go at night, or can he go to the mikvah during the day of day 7? And that's what this calculation is, because if we separate him for 7 days, and he's with his wife right before, so then if he can only go to the mikvah the night after day 7, that's already Yom Kippur, and that would be problematic. And therefore, the Gemara says maybe he is not like her, and therefore he can again, he waits 7 days, and then he can go to the mikvah, right? Again, if he can go to the mikvah during day 7, then it's okay to do work on day 8. Or maybe he has to wait through day 8. And here the Gemara says that basically he is not going to be like her. He really can't. We don't need this, right? We don't need till nightfall of day 8, and we can go back to this slide. This would be okay. He can go to the mikvah on day 7, and he can still do his work on Yom Kippur, which would be day 8. So sorry if that was a little complicated. But from here, we're going to get into an interesting discussion. We did see it, I don't know if you remember, but we did see it in Masechet Psachim. Here it's going to be a little bit different. Okay, the concept is in Hebrew or in Hebrew, the concept is Tuma Hutra Bitzibur. Is impurity, right? Tum'ah is impurity. Is impurity permitted in something that is public? Tzibur means in public. So hutra means mutar, permitted. Or is it dechuya? Dechuya means set aside, right? So is it set aside or permitted? What is the nafkamina? What is the practical difference between these two opinions? The question is, when we get to a situation where there is impurity, do we say, oh, this is going to be a communal sacrifice, therefore it doesn't matter at all? Or do we say, no, we have to try and prevent impurity as much as possible? And that is the difference of opinion we're going to see throughout Daf 6 and 7, of maybe, again, the fact that we separate the Kohen seems to imply that it is dechuya, meaning we're trying to do as much as we can to prevent him from being tameh, or right, but we do allow him to have visitors. Now, if we allow him to have visitors, maybe someone is going to drop dead, chas v'shalom, right in front of him, and he's going to be tameh. So maybe we should say, no, nobody's allowed to see him. And the Gemara says, no. People in general don't drop dead when they're walking down the street. We're not concerned about that, and therefore it's okay. He could see other people. Then the Gemara asks, I guess, like other permutations of this, other situations, right? Let's say the priests that are on duty at the Beit HaMikdash, in the temple. Some of them are tameh, some of them are pure, and some of them are impure. Everybody agrees that the pure, the Kohanim, the priests that are pure, should do the avodah, should do the work. But what happens if they all become impure for some reason? Do we say, oh, Tuma hutra b'tzibur, meaning it is completely permissible when dealing with communal sacrifices that it's okay if you are impure and therefore they can do the work? Or do we go out and look for a whole new group of priests to come and do the work? So again, some say that you go out and you look for them. Others say, no, it's okay. If they're impure, they could do the work. Now, I just want to take a step back for 1 minute, because for those of you who have been studying with together with us from Masechet Psachim, we did discuss this concept of impurity being okay with the community. But if you remember when we discussed it, it was about all of Am Yisrael, right? All the Jew. Remember we discussed if the majority of the Jewish people were tameh, were impure, so then everybody can bring the Korban Pesach with if they're impure. It would be okay, right? They could even go up to the Temple Mount even if they were impure. This is different. Here we're talking about a sacrifice that is communal, right? Again, any sacrifice that's given for again the tamid, the work that's done, the sacrifices for Yom Kippur, those are all communal sacrifices. And here we're talking about one Kohen or a group of Kohanim who are going to be impure, and it seems that that would be okay. So it's a different, I would say it's a different side of the coin of what we discussed in Masechet Psachim. And I think, of course, the difference is that the question is the Korban Pesach, is it a communal sacrifice or a personal sacrifice? And we can understand how it's a little bit of both. So that's just an aside. Okay, what happens? The Gemara on the top of 7 asks, what happened if the Korban, the Omer, again, as Lynn mentioned today, we are counting the Omer, and what happens if the sacrifice of the Omer became Tameh? Do you have to find a new one or not? Right, again, we're going to say, if you can find a new one, it is better. If you can't, it is okay, and you could bring the impure sacrifice to the temple. What about if the libations, the nesachim that were brought with the sacrifices, if they became impure, right? Again, we should bring more, because, and even though it's a communal sacrifice, the Gemara says no. This is something that has that is a specific sacrifice that doesn't have a set time, or maybe it's private and therefore you have to find make sure to go and find a pure sacrifice. 1 second, I see there's a question. Yes. Okay, so Lisa's asking, if you're representing the people, shouldn't you be pure? Yes, 100%. That is very important, and that is the best way to do the avodah, the service in the temple, 100%. Here, the Gemara is bringing up cases where what we would call bidi eved, meaning we're in a situation that is not optimal, right? Something happens where all the priests on duty are now impure. Do we say the service is what's important and therefore they should do it anyway? And we're going to see how that works actually in 1 second, because there's going to be a mechanism that is going to purify the temple. Or do we say exactly what you're asking, Lisa? Do we say, no, it's very important for the person doing the service that person should be pure, and go out and find another priest to do it, right? Go to Yerushalayim and delay the sacrifice for a little bit in order that the person doing it is pure. So you're right. That is the tension. Again, we have mentioned this before. The Gemara always works with like comparing different tensions, right? I have this variable and this variable. Which way do we pull, right? What is more important, that the sacrifice be sacrificed on time, or the purity of the priest who is giving it? So you're right, exactly so. Those are the conflicting ideals that we're trying to deal with. Now, to add to that, the Gemara explains that the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, wore the headband, the tzitz. That tzitz the headband, said on it, Kodesh LeHashem, sanctified to God. And it seems that the Gemara explains that this headband, what was its role? It was there to purify things that were impure in the temple. What does that mean? That if something happened and something became impure, this headband magically, spiritually transformed that object into purity, right? And then that seems to prove that tuma hutra betzibur, right? It becomes permitted. It transforms it and makes it okay. So here, the Gemara at the bottom of 7 discusses, does the Kohen need to be wearing it for it to work? Or can it just be like hanging on the hook, right, in his office, right? If it's broken, for sure, we understand it doesn't work, but maybe it doesn't actually have to be worn. It could even just be somewhere on the Temple Mount, and that would be okay. The Gemara at the top of Daf 8 compares the tzitz to tefillin, which I think is a beautiful image, right? Meaning people wear tefillin today on their forehead, and that brings us back to this idea of the high priest, of the Kohen Gadol, wearing the tzitz on his forehead, this idea that there's a recognition of God, right? An awareness that God should be above us, right? That's also where the kippah comes from, right? So it's interesting, the Gemara at the top of 8 says the tzitz only has the name of God once, but tefillin has the name of God many times. So think about how powerful tefillin really are. And when one is wearing tefillin, one needs to be constantly reminded of it, right? Aware of it, like to touch it. They're both worn on the same area, right, on the forehead. Okay, let's go back to our Kohen Gadol who's getting sprinkled on. Remember, we said that the priest is sprinkled for 7 days. Again, we have 2 priests. We have, again, 2 instances, I should say. The high priest, the Kohen Gadol, on Yom Kippur, before Yom Kippur, and the Kohen, the priest that is going to do the Para Aduma, the red heifer, the ceremony on Har HaZeitim, on the Mount of Olives. So now we're going to have a 3-way machloket, a 3-way difference of opinion. Are they sprinkled for all 7 days? Or maybe they're sprinkled just day 3 and 7. So 3 and 7 is from the idea of the purification process for someone who became impure by being in contact with a dead body, tumat met. The way that person became purified was that they needed to be sprinkled on with the water that was mixed with the ashes of the red heifer on day 3 and day 7. And then on day 7, they went to the mikvah, and that was the end of the process. So either they're getting sprinkled, the priest is getting sprinkled all 7 days, or 3 and 7, or maybe there's a difference between these 2 priests, that the priest who's doing the Para Aduma is 7 days, but the high priest for Yom Kippur is only day 3 and 7. So we're going to talk about these 3 opinions. So the question is, again, what is the machloket? What are they really arguing about? So one opinion is maybe they're arguing about what we mentioned before on this slide. Is impurity totally permitted, hutra, or dechuya, pushed away, just set aside, right? So are we going to do the maximum that we can do, meaning sprinkle every day, or we do like the minimum, which is 3 and 7? We say, no, maybe that's not the machloket. Maybe the machloket is, do you need to go to the mikvah and get sprinkled on time? And therefore, we're going to see that the Gemara is going to say, right, that we're basically concerned that every day might be day 3 and day 7 because we're not sure exactly when the priest might have gotten impure or came in contact with a dead body. And we'll talk about that in a minute, how he gets sprinkled on every day. Just an interesting aside. When the priest did the service with the red heifer, the para aduma. Now, again, and this is an excellent point for you, Lisa, who mentioned, shouldn't they be as pure as possible? So an interesting occurrence happened. In the time of the second temple, there were the Sadducees, the Tzdukim. The Tzdukim were a sect of Jews who negated the oral law. And they said, we are only going according to the written law and not according to the oral law. And what did they say? Exactly what you said, that the priest who does the service for the para aduma needs to be tahor, he needs to be pure, 100%. However, the oral law says that if someone became tameh, impure, but a lower level of impurity, meaning from a sheret, from a creepy crawly creature, that person is only tameh for one day. That person can go to the mikvah that day. Now, really, he needs to wait till the nighttime, and they needed to wait till nighttime for that person to be completely pure. However, right, this person is called a tvul yom, meaning he went to the mikvah, he immersed that day. He's not 100% pure, but he's on his way. The oral law says that a person who is a tvul yom, meaning this person who went to the mikvah today, can do the service of the para aduma. Now, as I mentioned, what happened? There were priests that were tzdukim, and they couldn't tell who was a Sadducee and who wasn't. And therefore, they came up with a plan. The plan was that on the very last day, they were going to impurify, that's not a word, but they were going to make the Kohen impure, tameh sheret, make him go to the mikvah, and if he was a Sadducee, he wouldn't do the para aduma because he didn't believe that you could do it. And that was a way to figure out who was the real Kohen and who wasn't. Now, again, this goes back to what I mentioned. We have conflicting values. On one hand, we want to make sure the person is as pure as possible. On the other hand, they wanted to make sure that the Kohen who was doing the work was a prushi, was a Torah-abiding Jew, and not a Sadducee. So that's just an aside that I just wanted to explain. Okay, very quickly. Yes, Lynn, it mentions the idea of not sprinkling on Shabbat. We actually mentioned this in Masechet Psachim. It is a rabbinic ordinance, a rabbinic prohibition that you are not allowed to sprinkle on Shabbat because you are now transforming this person from impure to pure. And we know from learning Masechet Shabbat that we're not supposed to transform people or things on Shabbat. It's like creating. And therefore, they did not sprinkle on Shabbat. However, you are correct. You can go to the mikvah on Shabbat. The reason you can go to the mikvah on Shabbat is because it is time sensitive, right? A woman who needs to go to the mikvah after her 7th day, meaning the nighttime, I want to say must, but really should go on that day or that night, and therefore you are allowed to go on Shabbat. So that is an interesting question where we see there is a differentiation. We learned in Masechet Psachim that the sprinkling could be done on the next day, and therefore it is not going to be doche Shabbat. It is not going to override Shabbat. So excellent. So we see that actually on Daf 8 that we do not sprinkle on Shabbat. And just in the last few minutes, let's do Daf 9. Daf 9 talks about, again, this the room that they went to was called Lishkat Parhedrin. Parhedrin means like this lowly officer of the court. The question is why? Wasn't it usually called the office or the place where the aristocrats were? And the Gemara here says, well, it's a difference in the generations. In the first temple, where people were very pure and law-abiding, it was called the Lishkat, the area of the aristocrats. Later on, we're going to see in a minute how the generations were so terrible. Every year there was a new high priest because they actually bought their position, which we know you're not allowed to do. And therefore it was called Lishkat Parhedrin because of these officers. From here, the Gemara talks about the I would say what we call in Hebrew Yiridat Hadorot, how generations get worse as time goes on. And it says that in the beginning, when people feared God, they would increase their days, and how the Beit HaMikdash, the first temple, stood for 410 years, and there were only 18 high priests, meaning they lasted a long time. What do I say lasted? What does that mean? That if someone was not worthy to be the high priest and he entered the Holy of Holies, the Kodesh HaKodashim, he would die. So in the second temple, it lasted for 420 years, and there were 300 priests for 420 years. And the Gemara discusses, and I brought it for you here, in those 420 years, you subtract, these were actually the four high priests who were very holy and they deserved being there. You can see how many years they served: 40 years, 80 years, 10, and 11. And therefore, if you subtract the good years from the bad years, right, you're only left with 279 years. Again, we're starting with 420. You subtract 141, it leaves you 279, and there were 296 296 Kohanim for 279 years. So you can see how terrible those days were. And from here, the Gemara now starts comparing, right? They asked, why was the tabernacle, the Mishkan, destroyed in Shiloh? If anybody's in Israel, I definitely suggest you going to Shiloh to see where the temple stood, the tabernacle, the Mishkan. The Mishkan was there for 310 years, but it was destroyed because of the immorality and the defiling of the sacrifices by the sons of Eli, who was the priest who worked in the Mishkan then. And from here we discuss, why were the temples destroyed, right? The Gemara says that the first temple was destroyed because of the three cardinal sins, right? Idolatry, immorality, and murder, right? They were murdering people. The Gemara goes through the verses, how we see all these three things. The second temple was destroyed because of sinat chinam, right? Blind hatred. And the Gemara says, you can see, right, if the second temple was destroyed because of baseless hatred, and you compare it, how great or terrible is baseless hatred, it's comparable to the three cardinal sins. So you can see how terrible that was. Interestingly, the Gemara says, in the time of the second temple, people were religiously committed, right? They were studying Torah, but they were so corrupt that the temple was destroyed. And I think here we really see this idea of social justice, the importance of loving one another, and if not, it really leads to the destruction of the temple. And I'll take it a step further to say that it leads to the not rebuilding of the third temple, right? So I think that, again, there are those who say that Sfirat HaOmer, this time period, is a time of building character, of trying to develop ourselves. So I think this is another way to kind of inspire ourselves to work on our character development. And again, at the bottom of 9, the Gemara really asks, like, who is better, the people of the first temple or the people of the second temple, right? The fact that in the first temple they sinned in public, therefore their time of exile was in public or publicized. They knew it was only going to be 70 years. But the second temple, they sinned in private, which I think is the point is like it's worse. And therefore, our exile is private, right? We don't know when it is going to end. It was not publicized, and therefore it is much longer, right? Who were greater, the people of the first temple or the second temple? Again, it seems that the temple was rebuilt for the people of the first temple period, right? It was rebuilt, but it was not rebuilt for the second temple people because they were not so good. So again, this idea of who was worse, who was better. Again, the idea that at the end there was no more prophecy, but there was bat kol, right? This idea of a divine voice that came out of heaven that still existed. And I think that we will, let's stop here. We'll get to, we'll do Daf 11 next, we'll do Daf 10 next week. So with that, wish everyone a great week. Find some inspiration. Again, may we see the rebuilding of the next temple. And thank you very much, everyone. Have a Shavua Tov.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you. Yeah. Bye-bye.